As the name already suggests, the filter function in Python allows you to filter elements from an iterable that satisfy a specific condition. So let's say you have a list of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and you want to extract from this list the numbers that are even. So that would be 2, 4, and 6. And that is exactly one example filter where you could apply the filter function. So we're going to take a look at what filter does. Then we're going to have a look at how we use it with lists, tuples, and sets. Moving on, we're also going to have a look at how we can use it with lambda functions. And finally, we're going to look at a special case where the filter function is used with the parameter none to do something quite interesting. So let's get into it and look at what filter does. So what exactly does the filter function do and how do we use it? Let's say that we have a list of numbers, such as the one over here, and we would like to filter the numbers that are greater than the value of 6. And we want to create a new list with only the values 7 through to 10. One way that we could go about doing this is we could create an empty list, such as the results list over here. And subsequently, we could create a for loop, which is going to loop through the numbers list one by one. So we're taking the number in numbers, and we're going to check for each individual number if num is greater than 6. And if this statement is true, then we're going to append the number to the results list. And subsequently, we can go ahead and print the result out. So it should be no surprise that if I go ahead and execute this, we're going to get the desired result because we get the numbers 7 through to 10 in the console output. But let's see how we could do exactly the same thing in a bit of a simpler way by using the filter function. So if we were to use filter, we would first need to define a function to input as an argument. So we're going to define the function check greater than 6. And this function is going to check if a number is greater than 6 and subsequently return true if the number is greater than 6. But if it isn't, it is going to return false. All right, so how do we do that with the filter function? Over here, you can see I have a filter function. And what it does is it does exactly the same thing as the loop does over here. So we're going to get exactly the same result. But let's have a look at the syntax. So over here, we first have a function. And as a second argument, we have the numbers list. And so using these two arguments, we're then putting it into the filter function. And this over here is going to return a filter object. I'm going to write it as obj. And since it's going to return a filter object, that is not going to be legible for us. And that is exactly why we have also added the list over here at the front. So we're printing out a list of the filter object. And so let's go ahead and execute all of this, and you'll see that the result is going to be exactly the same as the one we had when we executed the loop. So let me go ahead and execute this, and you can see the result stays exactly the same. But let me just briefly show you that if I remove this list over here and remove the bracket at the back and execute all of this again, you can see that I'm getting a filter object. So that is exactly why I added the list to this print statement. Now it doesn't necessarily need to be a list, it could also be a set, for example. So if I go ahead and execute this now, then pay attention to the brackets over here. I'm getting a set because these are curly brackets, but it could also, for example, be a tuple. Tuple, how do we write tuple? Tuple, there we go. And if I go ahead and now run this again, you can see that we have a regular tuple. Next up, I want to show you that we can use the filter function with different data types. Specifically, we can use it with things like lists, tuples, or even sets. So at the very top, I've created three distinct containers of data. The first one is a list, the second one is a tuple, and the third one is a set. And this time around, we're not going to look for values that are greater than 6. Instead, we are going to check if a number is even. So we have this function defined over here called checkEven, which is going to check if the remainder after the division of 2, which is exactly what this modulo operator does over here, is equal to 0. So this line over here is simply checking if there is any remainder after dividing by 2, and if there isn't, then we have an even number. But if there is, then we do not have an even number. So we are going to return false if it's not the case. And these results that we get from the filter functions, so you can see over here, I've created 3 filter functions, 1, 2, and 3. And these individual results are going to be saved in the result list, the result tuple, and the result set. And you can see each and every time I have added the function as the first argument, the checkEven function, and then as the second argument, I have added the container with the numbers, which is the list, the tuple, and at the bottom, the set. And finally, I am going to simply print out these individual filter objects. So as I showed you earlier, this is going to return a filter object, obj. And afterwards, if we then return it back into a legible form of data, we can turn it back into a set, tuple, or a list. So I've misspelled it down here. Let's make this into a list. And that is exactly going to give us the correct result. So let me go ahead and underline this. So this over here is going to be legible for us, and it's going to return only the even numbers. So in this case, it's going to be 2, 4, and 6 is the result that we would expect. So let's go ahead and execute this. Let's start off by only executing the first 3 print statements over here. And you can see in the console output, after I run this, that we get the filter objects. I'm not sure you can see. Now you can see. You have the 3 filter objects. But of course, we don't want to see the objects. They're not interesting for us. We actually want to see the results. So let's go ahead and execute this again. And now you can see we get the desired results because we have a set, a tuple, and a list with only the even numbers showing. So that is exactly how we can use filters with lists, tuples, and sets. Next up, let's have a look at how we can use filters with lambda functions. You'll remember at the beginning when we were creating a list with the values greater than 6, we used a for loop at the very beginning. The next thing we did is we created this function and then put it into the filter built-in function and added the number as an argument, and that also gave us the desired results, specifically a list with the numbers 7, 8, 9, and 10. But there is even a step further that we can take to make this even simpler, and that is by using lambda functions, and they are compatible with the built-in filter function as well. So let me show you how we can actually simplify this code that I have highlighted even further. So using lambda function, we could simply print the list of the filter object, and as an argument, we can now pass in a lambda function, which is going to take x as an argument, and it's going to check if x is greater than 6. And if that's the case, then we're going to return it into our result. And of course, the second argument needs to be the numbers list. So then, if I go ahead and execute this over here, you can see I get the same result as I did earlier with all of this that I heard earlier. So if I execute the highlighted part, you can see I get the numbers 7, 8, 9, and 10. And if I execute this single line of code using a lambda statement, you can see I get exactly the same result. So that is exactly how you would use a lambda function with a filter. And let me give you a second example. You can also remember that we had another function called checkEven, which is going to check for even numbers. And if I go ahead and execute this, you can see that we had a numbers array. Let me perhaps copy it down here so we can see it. So there we go. So executing this, you can see I get the even numbers from the numbers array. And using a lambda function, so we're going to write lambda function again. One way we could do it is simply print out the list of the filter object, and that is going to take a lambda function. So we're going to write lambda, and it's going to take x as an argument, and then we're going to check if the modulo of 2 is going to be equal to 0. And then, in addition to that, we also need to add the numbers list as an argument. And if I go ahead and execute this, you can see the result is exactly the same. So bear in mind that you can also use these very handy lambda functions with the built-in filter function, which saves you from writing out an explicit function each and every time. The final thing that I want to cover is using the filter function with the parameter none. So over here you can see that I have a list, and the list is actually called a list, and in this list I have some arbitrary values. So there are values like false, true, 0 as a string, 0 as a number, none, and so on and so forth. And what I'm doing here is that in the filter function, I have put in none as a parameter where I would usually put a function. And in addition, I have also got the actual list as a parameter. So what will this actually filter out? Let's go ahead and have a look at what this does. I'm going to execute the code that you see on the screen. So select it and execute it. And you can see that the results have filtered out a couple of the values from the initial list. So let's see what stayed in, and let's see what was filtered out. So the 1 stayed in, the A stayed in, the 0 was filtered out, the false was filtered out, the true remained in, the 0 as a string remained in, the none was filtered out, the 12 was left in, and the hello was left in. So we can see that all this does is it filters the truthy. Truthy is sort of a nice word. It leaves the truthy values in the list. And what do I mean by truthy? Truthy are simply the values that would return true if I turned them into a Boolean. So let's see what that means if I go ahead and print out the bool of, for example, the value, let's see, 1, then you'll see that it returns true. And since it returns true, we are going to leave it in the list, and it is also going to be part of the new list once running through the filter. So the true will appear for all the individual values where I have left a tick underneath. So let's check this, for example, for a couple of other values. So the 12 over here was also a value that remained in the list, as you can see down here from the list which was output. And it is a truthy value because it returns true if we turn it into a Boolean value. You can see the 12 returns true, and in fact any number such as 15, 16, or any arbitrary number actually returns true with the exception of the 0. So the 0 does not return true, it returns false. And let's see what happens with a negative number. If I take -1, it also returns true. So 0 is the only number where the Boolean value of 0 is going to be returning false. And that the logic behind that applies to all the values over here. So let me give you one final example. If I, for example, take the Boolean value of the keyword none, then we are going to have false as an output. And since it is false, I have put a cross underneath here. It is not a truthy value, and it is also not output in the list. So that is exactly how the filter function works if you use none as a parameter.